Okay, so in this video we're going to go over how to repack or service a bearing. So I have my spindle here. This guy right here is called a dust cap. So we're going to take our dust cap pliers, fit around them, and squeeze. It just pops that off nice and easily like this. Now you can use a flathead screwdriver similar to this and go into the side, which is fine. Just make sure that we don't pin in these corners, which could affect the rotation of our spindle here. The next thing we want to do is remove this guy right here called a cotter pin. You'll notice it's actually bent over like that. That is to prevent, if anything does happen, this starts shaking, this prevents the nut from coming all the way out. The nut can only move, if you look into that hole right there, the nut can only move in that small amount of window here. So the cotter pin is a type of locking nut used in conjunction with this one here called a castle nut. So we want to take off the cotter pin. You can cut it sometimes if you need to. It just depends on the vehicle and how bad the pin is, or the cotter pin is. And pull the pin out. Now, if you do not have a socket or something that fits this, you can use multi-groove pliers. They fit right over top, and you can now turn them. These bearings actually don't have a whole lot of preload or torque on this nut, so it doesn't take much to break this nut free. See this piece right here? This is a flat washer. You notice there's actually a little cutout on the spindle here that's coming out. That is making sure this goes in the right spot. Sometimes you might need a small screwdriver just to lift it off because it's being held in by kind of grease. Pull that up. There you can see the tang sitting right there. That has to mesh up with that location right there. This guy right here, you can actually see that bearing there. You can shake the rotor a little bit and you can see that starts to come out. Take the whole thing off with the rotor and bearing all together. So now that the bearing is sitting inside there, you can pop the bearing right out. And what we want to do, this is your front wheel bearing. Here is the rear wheel bearing. To remove that, we have to take this back seal off. Here's a seal puller. You just want to go just inside the lip and pull. We take the seal out and the rear wheel bearing comes out. Now to service these, what we first need to do is clean all the old bearing grease off of there. So you're going to take your parts cleaner and basically spray each of them off. You want to make sure that you take all the rollers, roll them around, making sure that there's no more old grease inside there. Then you want to inspect it. Each little tiny roller, make sure there's no pitting, scratches, or anything else like that, which can cause excessive amount of noise. All right, so this is how you pack the bearing. I've cleaned it all up, I've inspected everything, is all good to go. The fun part is you're going to take a big glob of bearing grease, put it on the palm of your hand, and what you're going to do is, using from the bottom of your bearing, you're actually going to push and slide. Push and slide off your hand. As you're doing that, you're actually forcing the bearing grease to go up and work to the top. You can't just take the grease and do one of those. It will not go inside the bearing, and this will burn out quickly. So you work your way all the way around. If you go right across the top here, you'll start to see the grease filling in. Once it's completely filled, you're now ready to reinstall it. So I'll finish up my bearing packing here. Completely packed. We want to go back to our rotor, slide it inside there. We've already done all our inspections, so the bearing race is all good to go. We want to reinstall the rear seal. Put that in there. Sometimes you might need an installer to install that. This one's pretty loose at this point. We install that. We're going to retake our rotor. The spindle's all cleaned off. We're going to reinstall the rotor. Make sure that the bearing is in the correct orientation. So I've already packed the front bearing. The taper goes towards the rotor. Discuss the washer beforehand, I'm going to make sure that that tang there lines up with the tang on the spindle. Slide that on there. Then we take our castle nut and we're going to slide it on. Once you're at this point, you don't need to hold onto the rotor to keep it in place. It's not going to fall off. You can now tighten this up. This actually doesn't require a whole lot of torque, more or less just some preload on the bearing. So we're going to seat the nut, back it off a little bit. What we use here is the beam style torque wrench. I'm looking for rotational torque. So as I'm turning it, that will actually flex and point to the rotation or the amount of torque it does required to torque it. Because it's not on a vehicle, it actually won't rotate. But as you can see, you're watching the needle actually start to deflect. If this is rotating, I'd be doing it at the same time to check that. Once I set my torque, you may need to back it off slightly to access the bridge for it, the opening for our cotter pin. Always use a new cotter pin. We're going to slide that in place. Take your diagonal pliers. We want to bend the ears in opposite directions of each other. Just in case something happens that this nut starts to back itself out, this cotter pin will stop it as it's acting like a locking nut, as discussed when we took it apart. Again, slide them, bend them over. We're going to take our dust boot cover, slide that in place using a mallet. Do not use a metal hammer or steel hammer, and seat that in place.